There is one type of empath that avoidant people cannot handle. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it does not chase, it does not beg, and it does not try to prove its worth. And when an avoidant finally meets this kind of presence, something shifts in a way they never expect. Because this empath does something that breaks the pattern completely. They do not run, they do not fight, they do not stay and over-explain. They walk away quietly, clearly, and with a level of self-control that feels unfamiliar. And that is exactly what changes everything. Most people believe that emotional distance means a lack of care. That belief keeps them stuck in the same cycle. The more distance appears, the more they try to close the gap. The more they try, the more the other person pulls away. It becomes a loop that drains energy, confidence, and self-respect. But there is a deeper psychological dynamic happening beneath the surface, one that very few people truly understand. Avoidant behavior is driven by hidden fears, silent triggers, and a strong need for control. And when those patterns meet someone who refuses to play along, the entire dynamic begins to collapse. In this video, you will learn exactly why this one empath type has such a powerful effect on avoidant personalities. You will understand the hidden psychology behind emotional withdrawal and why chasing only makes it worse. You will also discover the subtle behaviors that create attraction, respect, and even confusion in someone who usually stays distant. These are small shifts, but they carry a deep impact. This is where emotional intelligence becomes power. There is also a side to this dynamic that rarely gets talked about. It is not about manipulation. It is not about forcing someone to change. It is about something much deeper. It is about the moment a person stops abandoning themselves just to keep someone else close. And that moment creates a kind of presence that cannot be ignored. That is the moment when the balance of power quietly shifts. Stay with this video until the end because the final insight will change the way you see connection, distance, and self-worth. It will give you clarity that most people spend years trying to find. And once you understand it, you will never respond to emotional distance in the same way again. Welcome to our channel, where we break down human behavior in a simple and powerful way. Subscribe now to stay connected and to keep learning the patterns that shape every relationship in your life. Avoidant people fear emotional closeness in a way that is often misunderstood. It does not always look like fear on the surface. It can look calm, distant, or even controlled. But underneath that behavior, there is a quiet discomfort that appears the moment things start to feel real. As soon as a connection begins to deepen, as soon as emotions carry weight, something inside them starts to pull back. It is not always a conscious decision, it feels automatic. Closeness begins to feel heavy, and distance begins to feel safe again. This is where the pattern usually begins. The other person senses that distance and reacts to it. They move closer, they ask more questions, they try to understand what changed, they try to fix it before it turns into something permanent. Effort increases, attention increases, emotions become stronger. From their point of view, it feels like care, it feels like trying to protect the connection, but from the avoidant perspective, that same energy feels different. It feels like pressure building up, like expectations growing, like space slowly disappearing. So the more one person tries, the more the other pulls away. The more explanations are given, the less they are received. It creates a loop that feeds itself. One person becomes more present, the other becomes more distant. One person speaks more, the other becomes quieter. It feels confusing because the effort seems right, but the result keeps moving in the wrong direction. Then there is a different response that shifts everything. This empath type does not follow that usual reaction. They still feel deeply, they still notice the change, but they do not rush to close the gap. They do not chase answers or try to force clarity in the moment. Instead of moving closer when distance appears, they allow space to exist. They step back in a calm and controlled way without turning it into a struggle. That quiet shift interrupts the entire pattern. The expected reaction never comes, the pressure disappears. The dynamic changes in a way that feels unfamiliar, and that is where things begin to move in a completely different direction. An avoidant person is often misunderstood as cold or uninterested, but that surface impression hides something much deeper. The distance they create is not always a lack of feeling. In many cases, it is the opposite. They feel too much, too fast, and without a clear way to manage it. That intensity does not show as openness, it shows as withdrawal. It shows as silence, delayed responses, or a sudden need for space that seems to appear without warning. This pattern usually begins early. At some point, closeness stopped feeling safe. It may have come from inconsistent attention, emotional neglect, or moments where vulnerability was met with discomfort instead of support. Over time, the mind learns a simple rule: getting close leads to stress. Depending on someone creates risk. Emotional exposure feels like losing control. So instead of moving toward connection, the system builds a habit of stepping away from it. As adults, this habit continues in subtle ways. When conversations become more meaningful, when feelings are expressed more clearly, or when expectations start to form, something inside them tightens. It becomes harder to stay present. The need for distance grows stronger. This is why they can seem fully engaged one moment and distant the next. It is not random. It is a response to emotional depth increasing beyond what feels manageable. Distance, in this case, feels like control. It creates space to breathe, space to think, space to return to a state that feels stable. Closeness, on the other hand, begins to feel like pressure. It carries the weight of expectations, the fear of losing independence, and the discomfort of being seen too clearly. Even positive emotions can feel overwhelming when they come with intensity. Because of this, avoidants often send mixed signals without intending to. They may enjoy connection, yet resist it at the same time. They may care deeply, yet struggle to show it consistently. Their behavior is not driven by a desire to push people away for no reason. It is shaped by an internal need to protect themselves from a kind of closeness that once felt unsafe and still feels difficult to fully trust. Empaths feel deeply, and that depth shapes how they respond when something begins to shift in a relationship. When they sense distance, they do not ignore it. They notice the smallest changes in tone, energy, and attention. A slower reply, a shorter message, a slight emotional pullback. All of it registers immediately, and because connection matters to them, their first instinct is to move closer rather than step back. They lean in with more care, more effort, and more emotional presence, believing that this will bring things back to where they were. They start trying to fix what feels off. They ask questions to understand what changed. They offer reassurance, patience, and openness. They explain their feelings more clearly, hoping that honesty will rebuild the connection. They stay present even when the other person becomes distant, because leaving feels like giving up on something meaningful. In their mind, love means effort, and effort means staying through uncertainty. It feels right to keep showing up, even when the response on the other side becomes quieter. This response comes from a good place. It is driven by empathy, awareness, and a genuine desire to make things work. But the effect it creates can be very different from what is intended. As the empath moves closer, the avoidant begins to feel the weight of that closeness. Every question feels like a demand for clarity. Every attempt to connect feels like an increase in expectation. Even calm and caring energy can start to feel intense when someone is already overwhelmed internally. So while the empath is trying to create safety, the avoidant experiences pressure. While one person is trying to understand, the other feels like they are losing space. The more effort is given, the more distance appears in return. It becomes a cycle where both people are reacting in ways that make sense to them, yet the gap between them continues to grow. From the empath side, it feels confusing because the intention is pure. It feels like offering love should bring people closer. But from the avoidance side, that same energy can feel heavy, like something that needs to be escaped rather than embraced. There is one type of empath that changes the entire dynamic in a quiet but powerful way. This person still feels deeply, still understands emotions on a level that others often miss, yet something about the way they carry themselves is different. Their presence feels steady, grounded, and clear. They do not rush to fix every shift, and they do not treat distance as something they must immediately solve. There is a calm sense of awareness in how they respond, and that alone sets them apart. This is the self-respecting empath. The one who has learned that feeling deeply does not mean losing control. They understand emotions, but they do not allow those emotions to take over their actions. When something changes, they notice it, but they do not react impulsively. They give space where it is needed, both to the other person and to themselves. Their focus is not only on the connection, but also on maintaining their own sense of balance within it. They care, but their care does not turn into chasing. They listen, but they do not overextend themselves to be heard. When communication becomes unclear, they do not force clarity in a way that feels heavy. They allow things to unfold instead of trying to control the outcome. There is a quiet confidence in knowing that connection cannot be built through pressure. It has to come naturally, without one person carrying the weight for both. This kind of empath does not abandon themselves to keep someone else close. They stay present, but they also stay grounded in their own needs. If something feels off, they acknowledge it internally instead of immediately trying to fix it externally. That small shift creates a completely different energy. It removes urgency, removes tension, and replaces it with a sense of stability that feels unfamiliar to someone used to emotional intensity. They choose connection, but they do not confuse it with attachment. Connection feels open, mutual, and balanced. Attachment, when it becomes unhealthy, starts to feel like dependence, like needing something to stay in place to feel secure. The self-respecting empath understands that difference. They allow connection to grow, but they do not hold on to it in a way that creates pressure. Avoidants move through relationships with a set of expectations that often go unspoken. They are used to a certain pattern repeating itself. When they create distance, the other person usually responds by moving closer. There is more messaging, more explaining, more effort to hold things together. Over time, this becomes predictable. It reinforces a sense of control, where they can step back and still feel the connection reaching toward them. That pursuit, even when it comes from care, keeps the dynamic familiar and manageable from their side. Because of this, they begin to expect it. They expect you to chase when they pull away. They expect you to ask what is wrong, to seek reassurance, to try to prove that the connection is still worth holding on to. That expectation shapes how they behave, even if they are not fully aware of it. Distance becomes a way to regulate their emotions, and the response they receive confirms that they are still in control of the pace and intensity of the relationship. Then this empath responds differently. They do not follow that expected script. When distance appears, they notice it, but they do not react with urgency. There is no sudden increase in effort, no pressure for immediate clarity. They remain calm, grounded, and present without trying to pull the other person back in. Instead of moving closer, they create space as well. It is not done out of anger or withdrawal, but out of self-respect and emotional awareness. This shift interrupts the pattern in a way that feels unfamiliar. The usual response is missing. The space that was created is no longer being filled by someone else's effort. For the first time, the avoidant begins to feel something different. The sense of control starts to slip because the dynamic is no longer one-sided. The distance they created is now real, without someone constantly trying to close it. In that silence, something changes. Silence becomes louder than words because there is no reassurance covering it. Absence becomes real because there is no immediate presence replacing it. The lack of reaction creates a space where thoughts and emotions that were once avoided begin to surface, and the entire experience starts to feel different from anything they are used to. This is where things begin to flip in a quiet but noticeable way. The pattern that once felt predictable starts to shift, and the avoidant begins to experience something unfamiliar. Without the usual pursuit, there is more space to think. That space brings awareness that was easy to avoid before. Thoughts start to surface more clearly. Questions appear where there used to be certainty. The absence of pressure allows them to process the situation in a different way, without feeling overwhelmed by someone else's expectations. Along with that thinking, there is also a gradual return of feeling. Emotions that were pushed aside begin to come back into focus. There is more curiosity, more reflection, and a subtle awareness of what might be slipping away. The connection that once felt easy to step back from begins to feel more real when it is no longer being held in place by constant effort. That shift creates a sense of movement from within, rather than a reaction to external pressure. As this internal process unfolds, there can be a slow movement forward. The avoidant may start to come closer again, but in a way that feels more intentional. It might show through small actions, brief moments of openness, or a renewed effort to engage. This movement does not always come with clear explanations. It can feel subtle, almost hesitant, as if they are testing the space to see if it still feels safe. The difference is that this approach comes from their own pace, rather than being pulled in by someone else's urgency. At the same time, it is important to see this shift with clarity. This change does not always mean that the person has fully transformed or resolved their patterns. In many cases, it is the dynamic itself that has changed. The removal of pressure, the absence of chasing, and the presence of calm distance create a new environment. In that environment, the avoidant can engage without feeling overwhelmed. The shift is less about a complete change in personality and more about a change in how the interaction feels. When the dynamic changes, behavior often follows, and that is where this turning point begins to take shape. There is a deeper truth in all of this that becomes clear over time. This is not about creating a strategy to make someone chase you. It is not about reversing roles or trying to gain control over another person's behavior. The focus shifts away from them and moves back to you. It becomes about recognizing a pattern that no longer serves you and choosing to step out of it with awareness. The moment that shift happens, the energy behind every action begins to change. Instead of chasing someone who keeps creating distance, there is a quiet decision to stop running after what continues to move away. That decision does not come from anger or frustration. It comes from clarity. It comes from understanding that connection cannot be forced into place through effort alone. When one person is always moving forward and the other is always stepping back, the balance never settles. At some point, that imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The power in this situation does not come from creating distance as a tactic. It comes from self-respect. It comes from knowing where you stand and refusing to compromise your emotional stability to maintain a connection that feels uncertain. Self-respect shows up in small but meaningful ways. It shows in how you respond, how you communicate, and how you choose to engage. It removes the urgency to prove your worth because your value is no longer dependent on someone else's reaction. There is a shift from proving to choosing. Instead of trying to show why you are worth staying for, you begin to decide whether the connection itself is aligned with what you need. That change in perspective brings a sense of calm that replaces the need for constant validation. It allows you to stay present without losing your sense of self in the process. At the same time, there is a movement away from holding on too tightly. Letting go does not always mean walking away completely. It can also mean releasing the need to control the outcome, releasing the attachment to how things should unfold. That release creates space for something more balanced, where connection can exist without pressure and where your sense of self remains steady within it. In the end, it all comes back to one simple shift that changes everything. The empath who brings avoidance to their knees is not the one who tries harder, explains more, or stays longer than they should. It is the one who finally stands up for themselves, quietly, firmly, without turning it into a fight. There is no need to become louder, no need to prove anything, no need to force a reaction, just clarity, clear actions, clear boundaries, and a clear sense of self that does not bend under emotional pressure. That clarity creates a completely different presence. It removes the need to chase, removes the need to convince, and removes the need to hold on to something that keeps slipping away. And in that space, something powerful happens. The dynamic shifts without effort. The energy changes without words. Because when you stop chasing, you are no longer part of the pattern that kept things stuck. You step out of it, and that alone makes you different. When that happens, you become the one they cannot easily reach anymore. Not because you are hiding, and not because you are playing games, but because you are no longer available in the same way. Your value is no longer something that is constantly offered without balance. It becomes something that stands on its own, steady and grounded. Have you ever felt this shift in your life, where you stopped chasing and everything started to feel different? Or maybe you are beginning to notice it now in small ways that are slowly becoming clearer. Share your thoughts in the comments because your experience might help someone else understand this journey better. And if this video gave you a new perspective, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insights that help you see people, patterns, and yourself with greater clarity.